The words hit me like a wrecking ball, even through the thick oak of the boardroom door. She's a relic. Her designs are sentimental. Time to phase her out. My name is Eleanor Vance, and for 25 years, I wasn't just an architect at Sterling and Thorne, I was part of its bedrock. I believed loyalty and quiet dedication were currencies that always held their value, that the integrity of a blueprint was sacred. I was about to learn how quickly that market could crash, how easily history could be erased for a bottom line. But they underestimated one thing. The blueprints of the past sometimes hold the keys to the future. And I still had mine. It was a Tuesday late afternoon. The kind of gray, listless day where the city outside my office window seemed to hold its breath. I'd stayed late, as I often did, refining the site plans for the new community library. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway was usually a comforting sound, a familiar backdrop to my thoughts. My office, on the third floor, was tucked away at the end of a long corridor, just past the main conference room. I was walking towards the small kitchenette to make one last cup of tea before heading home when I heard voices. Raised slightly, then quickly hushed. The boardroom door was ajar, just a crack. Ordinarily, I would have walked on by. Company politics, executive chatter, it was never my arena. My focus was always on the work, on the lines on the paper, on the spaces that would one day become real. But then I heard my name. Or rather, a description that could only be me. The Hawthorne Project, yes, it was a success, but that was 10 years ago. We need fresh blood, new perspectives. Eleanor's she's rooted in the past. That was Julian Croft's voice. Our new CEO. He'd been with Sterling and Thorne for all of 6 months, parachuted in after Mr. Sterling finally retired. Julian was young, polished, with a vocabulary full of buzzwords like synergy and disruption. He wore suits that cost more than my first car, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Another voice, smoother, sycophantic, I thought it might be Henderson from finance, murmured agreement. Her overhead is significant. For someone who isn't bringing in the new wave clientele, I froze. My hand, halfway to pushing the kitchenette door, stopped midair. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the hallway. I shouldn't have listened. I knew that. But it was like watching a car accident unfold. You couldn't look away. Julian continued, his tone decisive. We'll need to restructure her role. Senior design consultant, perhaps. A significant pay adjustment, naturally. Frame it as a strategic realignment. She'll either take it or... He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. A relic. Sentimental. That's what I was to him. 25 years. A quarter of a century poured into this firm. I remembered old Mr. Sterling, Arthur Sterling, his hand on my shoulder after we won the bid for the Children's Museum. Eleanor, he'd said, his voice gruff with emotion, you don't just design buildings. You understand their souls. He saw architecture as a legacy, a conversation between generations. Julian saw it as a commodity. I thought of the late nights, the weekends spent hunched over drafting tables, long before CAD software made things easier. The scent of tracing paper and graphite was practically imprinted on my DNA. I'd mentored countless young architects who had passed through these halls, taught them that a building wasn't just steel and glass, but a response to human need, to the environment, to history. I'd cleaned up messes, salvaged projects that others had nearly derailed, always quietly, without fanfare. I never sought the spotlight. The work was its own reward. Or so I believed. The ache started in my chest, a dull, heavy throb. It wasn't just anger, though that was there, a cold spark. It was a profound sense of disillusionment, like discovering the beautiful, sturdy oak tree you'd always sheltered under was rotten at the core. I'd given Sterling and Thorne the best years of my life, my unwavering loyalty. And in return, I was being discussed like a piece of outdated furniture to be phased out. I took a slow, silent step back, then another, away from the cracked door. The tea could wait. Suddenly, I felt an urgent need to be within the familiar confines of my own office, surrounded by my own blueprints, the tangible evidence of what I had built. The echo of Julian's words followed me down the empty hall, cold and sharp. The next few days passed in a strange sort of haze. I went about my work, attended meetings, responded to emails, all with an outward calm I didn't feel. Inside, a storm was brewing. Every interaction with Julian Croft was now colored by what I'd overheard. His breezy morning, Eleanor, felt like a thinly veiled taunt. His talk of modernizing the brand and embracing innovation sounded like a coded message that my contributions, my very presence, were no longer valued. I found myself observing him more closely, noticing the way he dismissed long-serving staff with a flick of his wrist, the way his eyes lit up when discussing potential profit margins rather than design integrity. He was all surface, no depth. A stark contrast to Arthur Sterling, who could spend hours discussing the texture of a particular brick or the way light would fall in a room at different times of day. Mr. Sterling understood that architecture was a craft, an art form. Julian treated it like an assembly line. Then came the email, an invitation to a company-wide meeting. Subject: Sterling and Thorne, charting our future. Mandatory attendance. It was scheduled for the following Monday morning in the main presentation hall, the one we usually used for client pitches or celebrating major project wins. A knot tightened in my stomach. This was it. Monday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that seemed to seep through the glass walls of the office building. The presentation hall was already buzzing with low chatter when I arrived. I usually sat near the front, an old habit, but today I found myself lingering near the back, by the coffee station. Maya Sharma, a bright young architect I'd mentored on the children's hospital wing, gave me a small, hesitant smile. "Morning, Ellie," she said, her voice a little too bright. I wondered if she knew. If everyone knew. The air felt thick with unspoken anxieties. Julian strode onto the stage at precisely 9 a.m., impeccably dressed, a confident smirk playing on his lips. He launched into his presentation with a flourish, all slick graphics and corporate jargon. He spoke of streamlining operations, leveraging new technologies, and optimizing human capital. That last phrase sent a chill down my spine. Human capital. Is that what we were? Assets and liabilities on a spreadsheet? He moved through slides showcasing his vision. Lots of gleaming glass towers, minimalist interiors, designs that could have been plucked from any generic international city. There was no sense of place, no respect for context. It was architecture as a fashion statement, transient and shallow. I thought of the historic restoration projects I'd poured my heart into, the careful work of breathing new life into old bones, of preserving the city's soul. None of that seemed to feature in Julian's brave new world. Then he got to the part I'd been dreading. As part of this strategic realignment, he announced, his voice smooth and devoid of any real warmth, "We will be making some adjustments to our team structure. This is to ensure we have the right people in the right roles, maximizing efficiency and fostering a culture of dynamic innovation." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. My heart hammered against my ribs. I kept my face impassive, my hands clasped loosely in my lap. In line with this, he continued, "We will be redefining certain senior roles to better reflect our forward-thinking approach. Some of our long-standing team members, who have contributed significantly in the past, will be transitioning into new advisory capacities. This includes a revised compensation structure to align with these updated responsibilities." He didn't mention my name. He didn't have to. Every eye in that room, or so it felt, darted towards me. I could feel the weight of their pity, their curiosity, their discomfort. One or two of the older partners, men I'd worked alongside for decades, shifted uncomfortably in their seats but said nothing. Maya looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sympathy. It was a public demolition, executed with chilling precision. He hadn't just devalued my work, had done it in front of everyone, stripping away my standing in the company piece by piece, all under the guise of corporate progress. The humiliation was a raw, burning thing. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I met his gaze briefly, my expression carefully neutral, then looked back towards the stage as if his words were of no particular consequence to me. Inside, though, something had fractured. The quiet loyalty I'd held for Sterling and Thorne for so long felt like it was bleeding out onto the polished floor of that presentation hall. He called it charting a future. It felt more like he was trying to erase a past. My past. My contribution. And honestly, that was a mistake. The official notification arrived in a crisp, impersonal interoffice envelope the next morning. It was placed squarely in the center of my otherwise meticulously organized desk, an unwelcome intruder. My name, Eleanor Vance, was printed on the front by a laser printer. No handwritten note, no personal touch. Just cold, hard type. I let it sit there for a good hour, a silent testament to the new Sterling and Thorne, the one Julian Croft was so keen to build. I drank my coffee, reviewed the morning's emails, even sketched a preliminary idea for a small park pavilion someone had inquired about. Anything to delay the inevitable. Finally, I picked it up. The paper felt thin, insubstantial, despite the weight of its contents. Inside, as expected, was a formal letter outlining my new role as senior design consultant. The language was all corporate doublespeak, leveraging your extensive experience, strategic advisory capacity, focus on legacy knowledge transfer. It was a pretty package for a demotion. And then the numbers. A 40% reduction in salary. 40%. For the same title, essentially, but with responsibilities so vaguely defined they were meaningless. My core project leadership roles were gone, reassigned. My team, the one I'd carefully nurtured, would now report elsewhere. I was being moved to the sidelines, made into a figurehead with no real power, no real input. A ghost in the machine. Attached was a contract addendum, requiring my signature to accept these new terms. Effective immediately, it stated. They weren't even giving me time to process, to consider. It was an ultimatum dressed up as a business decision. I read it through twice, slowly, though the words seemed to blur before my eyes. Not with tears, I wouldn't give them that, but with a rising tide of something cold and resolute. It was as if all the warmth, the passion I'd felt for my work at this firm, was being systematically extinguished. I thought of Mr. Sterling again. He would have been appalled. He believed in rewarding loyalty, in nurturing talent, not discarding it like last year's fashion. He understood that a firm's strength lay in its people, in their accumulated wisdom and experience. Julian saw only a balance sheet. He saw me as an expense to be minimized. The irony was, my extensive experience was what had saved this firm more than once, pulled projects back from the brink, secured deals others had fumbled. But that history, it seemed, had no value in his new, streamlined future. I looked around my office. The walls were lined with framed blueprints of projects I was proud of. The Hawthorne Riverfront Complex, the City Art Gallery renovation, the Sustainable Living Center that had won a national award. Each one represented years of my life, countless hours of thought, dedication, and problem-solving. Were these now just relics? Sentimental artifacts of a bygone era? A quiet anger began to solidify within me, not hot and explosive, but cold and hard, like a shard of ice. They thought I would just accept this, fade quietly into the background, become the legacy consultant they envisioned, a toothless lioness content to sit in the sun. They underestimated my spine. It was forged in the fires of deadlines, client demands, and the unwavering pursuit of architectural integrity. It wouldn't break this easily. I picked up my favorite fountain pen, the one Mr. Sterling had given me when I made partner. The ink was a deep, steadfast blue. I uncapped it, the small click echoing in the sudden stillness of my office. I spread the addendum flat on my desk. Then, with a hand that was surprisingly steady, I signed my name, Eleanor Vance. Not with a flourish, not with resentment, but with a calm, deliberate stroke. I slid the signed document back into its envelope, sealed it, and stood up. Walking down the hall to the HR department felt different. The familiar parquet floor seemed to echo my footsteps with a new resonance. The air, usually filled with the low hum of a busy office, seemed to hold a watchful silence. When I handed the envelope to Susan in HR, she looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Already, Ellie?" she asked, her voice soft. She'd been with the firm almost as long as I had. She knew. Everyone knew. "Yes, Susan," I said, my voice even. "It's done." I didn't offer any explanation, no hint of my inner turmoil. I just gave her a small, polite nod and turned to leave. As I walked back to my office, I could feel her gaze on my back. Perhaps she expected tears or an outburst. Perhaps Julian did too. They would be disappointed. The ink on that paper wasn't a signature of surrender. It was the first stroke of a new design, one they couldn't yet see. The steel in my spine was still very much intact. The days that followed were strange. An unsettling quiet descended upon my corner of the office. Colleagues who used to drop by for a quick chat about a design challenge or just to share a coffee now offered polite, distant nods. Projects I had been leading were formally handed over in brief, sterile meetings. Julian Croft, when our paths crossed, would give me that overly bright, insincere smile, as if we were both in on some delightful secret. He clearly thought he'd won, that I'd been neatly sidelined. I let him think it. Silence, I've learned, can be a powerful shield, and sometimes a weapon. In that quiet, I began to reach out. Not in anger, not with pleas for help, but with a simple, understated honesty. There were people I'd worked with for years, clients who had become more than just accounts on a ledger. They were collaborators, people who understood the value of thoughtful design, of integrity, of a partnership built on trust. First, I called Marcus Thorne. His family had co-founded Sterling and Thorne generations ago, though he now ran his own successful development corporation. We'd worked together on half a dozen landmark projects. He was a man of few words, but immense integrity. I found him on his mobile, on a construction site somewhere, the sound of machinery, a distant hum in the background. "Marcus, it's Ellie Vance," I said. "Ellie, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" His voice was warm, direct. I explained briefly and factually the changes to my role at Sterling and Thorne. I didn't editorialize, didn't complain. I just stated the facts. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought the connection had dropped. Then Marcus spoke, his voice gravelly. "Ellie," he said, "you know my family's history with that firm. But let me be clear. We've worked with Sterling and Thorne for the past 15 years primarily because of you. Your vision, your standards. If you're not leading our projects well, that changes things. Significantly." He didn't need to say more. The unspoken affirmation was a balm to a wound I hadn't fully acknowledged. Next, I scheduled a coffee with Diana Marlowe. Diana was a city councilwoman, a formidable force in urban planning and heritage preservation. We'd fought side by side on the Hawthorne Riverfront revitalization, turning a derelict industrial wasteland into a vibrant community hub. She was sharp, no-nonsense, and had an unerring eye for quality. We met at a small cafe near City Hall. As I laid out the situation, her expression hardened. "So, Julian Croft thinks he can just sideline you?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "After everything you've done for the city? For the integrity of its architecture? He has no idea, does he?" I just sipped my coffee. "Ellie," she said, leaning forward, "the city's upcoming tender for the new Performing Arts Center, we were strongly leaning towards Sterling and Thorne, largely because we assumed you'd be spearheading the design. If that's no longer the case..." She let the sentence hang, but her meaning was crystal clear. The foundation of trust I'd built with her was personal, not institutional. Then there were Lena Hansen and Robert Bell. They were a young, dynamic duo who'd founded a nonprofit focused on sustainable, affordable housing. I'd worked with them pro bono on their first few projects, helping them navigate complex zoning laws and develop cost-effective, beautiful designs. They were idealists but pragmatic ones. When I told them, their reaction was one of quiet outrage, then fierce loyalty. "Ellie, you are the reason we even considered a firm like Sterling and Thorne for our larger upcoming community project," Lena said, her eyes flashing. "Your commitment to social value and design, that's rare. If the firm doesn't value that, doesn't value you." Robert nodded. "We're with you, Ellie. Whatever you decide to do." Each conversation was a small affirmation, a quiet rebuilding of something Julian had tried to tear down. They weren't just clients. They were people who saw my worth, who valued the substance over the style. They hadn't been loyal to the Sterling and Thorne name, not entirely. They'd been loyal to the work, to the principles, to me. And as I drove home that Friday evening, the city lights blurring through my windshield, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks, a quiet, determined hope. The foundations Julian couldn't see, the ones built on years of trust and mutual respect, were proving to be far stronger than he imagined. He thought he was dismantling my career. He had no idea he was actually clearing the site for something new. It was a Saturday morning, a few weeks after I'd signed Julian's demeaning addendum. I was in my home study, surrounded by books on architectural history, by rolls of old blueprints, by the quiet company of my own thoughts. The initial shock and anger had subsided, replaced by a cold clarity. I was sifting through some old project files, more for a sense of connection to my past work than for any specific purpose, when I came across the master file for the Hawthorne Riverfront Complex. That project, it had been a monumental undertaking more than 10 years ago now. It had transformed a derelict, almost forgotten stretch of the city's waterfront into a thriving district of parks, public spaces, restored heritage buildings, and carefully integrated new structures. It had been my baby, from the initial concept sketches to the final landscaping details. Arthur Sterling, then CEO, had given me incredible autonomy, trusting my vision implicitly. He'd fought for it alongside me, against considerable skepticism from some city officials and developers who just wanted to bulldoze and build high-rises. I pulled out the main contract document, a thick, bound volume. The kind of formal agreement that detailed every aspect of the project, from deliverables to liabilities. I hadn't looked at it in years. Out of habit, a professional lifetime spent scrutinizing details, I began to skim through it. My finger traced the dense paragraphs of legal jargon, the clauses and subclauses. And then I saw it. Section 8, Subclause B. My breath caught in my throat. It was a peculiar clause, one I vaguely remembered Mr. Sterling discussing with the city's legal team at the time. Given the scale and public importance of the Hawthorne redevelopment and the city's significant investment, they had wanted an extra layer of assurance for its long-term integrity. The clause stipulated that any new major construction or significant alteration to existing structures within the defined Hawthorne Riverfront Complex Zone, or any immediately adjacent properties impacting the zone's master plan, would require the written approval of the original lead architect from Sterling and Thorne who had overseen the Hawthorne project. That lead architect was me. My heart began to pound, a slow, steady drumbeat against my ribs. I read it again and then a third time to be absolutely sure. There it was, in black and white, signed by Arthur Sterling for the firm and by the then mayor for the city. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a legally binding covenant designed to protect the overall vision and quality of the Hawthorne district from piecemeal or inappropriate development in the future. At the time, it had seemed like a sensible, if slightly unusual, safeguard. Now it felt like a hidden key, one I hadn't even realized I possessed. Mr. Sterling, he'd always been a man of foresight. He believed in building things that lasted, not just physically, but in terms of their positive impact. He understood that a city's character was a fragile thing, easily eroded by short-sighted decisions. This clause was a testament to that belief. He couldn't have known, of course, how it might play out years later, under a very different kind of leadership. But his commitment to quality, his insistence on protecting the integrity of that landmark project, had inadvertently forged a shield. Or perhaps a very precise scalpel. I sat there for a long time, the heavy contract resting in my lap, the weight of its implications slowly sinking in. Julian Croft, with his grand plans for modernizing and monetizing every square inch of the city, would inevitably turn his attention to a prime location like Hawthorne. It was too valuable, too visible for him to ignore. And when he did, he would need my signature. The signature of the relic he was so eager to phase out. A slow smile touched my lips, the first genuine smile in weeks. It wasn't a smile of malice or even triumph, not yet. It was a smile of recognition. Recognition of a quiet power I hadn't known I held. The blueprints of the past, indeed, held keys to the future. And this particular blueprint had just revealed a masterstroke. I carefully placed the Hawthorne contract into a new, reinforced file folder. It was time to wait and to watch. Julian was about to learn that some foundations are built not just on concrete and steel, but on promises and on paper. And paper, as it turns out, can be a very powerful thing. The waiting didn't last long. Julian Croft, true to form, was a man in a hurry. About a month later, the internal memos started flying. Whispers turned into presentations. Sterling and Thorne, under Julian's bold leadership, was about to unveil its most ambitious project yet, Hawthorne Gateway Towers. The name itself made me wince. It was a massive, twin-towered complex of luxury condos and high-end retail, slated for a prime parcel of land directly abutting the Hawthorne Riverfront Complex, a piece of land that had deliberately been kept as open green space in my original master plan, a crucial visual and ecological buffer. Julian organized a lavish launch event. Invitations went out to city officials, potential investors, the media. It was to be held at a chic downtown hotel, complete with champagne, canapes, and a state-of-the-art virtual reality walkthrough of his gleaming new vision. He was clearly banking on this project to cement his reputation as a titan of industry, a man who could transform the city's skyline and, more importantly to him, the company's bottom line. I received an invitation, of course. A standard, glossy card. Attendance was, naturally, strongly encouraged for senior staff. The evening of the event, I dressed carefully. A simple, well-cut dark suit. Understated, professional. I arrived as the ballroom was already filling, the air thick with forced enthusiasm and the clinking of glasses. Julian was center stage, basking in the glow of the spotlights, shaking hands, his smile a predatory slash of white. He saw me, gave a cursory nod, then immediately turned back to schmooze a group of what looked like investment bankers. I was, to him, an irrelevant footnote. I found a quiet spot near the back, observing. The presentation was exactly what I expected. Flashy renderings of soulless glass towers, promises of unparalleled luxury, and projections of staggering profits. No mention of community impact, of architectural context, of the careful balance we had strived for in the original Hawthorne development. It was an assault on everything that project stood for. As Julian was winding up his triumphant speech, my phone buzzed discreetly in my purse. It was a text message, followed by an email. One from Diana Marlowe's office at City Hall, the other from the lead counsel of the bank consortium that was supposed to be financing Hawthorne Gateway Towers. Both messages were remarkably similar. They'd been alerted, by whom, I could only guess, perhaps a diligent city clerk reviewing old covenants, to a pre-existing contractual obligation requiring specific architectural approval for development in the Hawthorne designated zone. They were, therefore, putting a temporary hold on all permits and funding disbursements until this legacy compliance issue was resolved. Signature required. E. Vance, lead architect, Hawthorne Riverfront Complex Project. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The wheels were in motion. The next morning, my email chimed with an urgent meeting request from Julian's assistant. Subject: Hawthorne Gateway. Critical path item. 10 a.m. His office. Mandatory. I arrived 5 minutes early. Julian was pacing, his usual slick composure visibly frayed. 2 lawyers from the firm's legal department were already there, looking uncomfortable. Eleanor, thank you for coming, Julian said, his voice tight. He gestured to a chair. I sat, placing my briefcase calmly on my lap. There appears to be an administrative oversight. Some archaic clause in an old contract related to your original Hawthorne project. It seems your signature is needed to expedite things for Hawthorne Gateway. He tried to make it sound trivial, a mere formality. Archaic? I said, my voice quiet but clear. I believe the term used by the city and the bank was legally binding, Julian. His eyes narrowed. Look, Eleanor, I don't have time for semantics. This is a multi-million-dollar project. We need to move forward. Just sign the approval. It's a simple rubber stamp. He pushed a document across his polished desk towards me. A pre-filled approval form. I didn't touch it. Instead, I opened my briefcase and took out the reinforced file folder. From it, I extracted the original Hawthorne Riverfront Complex contract, bound in its faded blue cover. I opened it to Section 8, Subclause B, the relevant passage already highlighted. I slid it across the desk to him, right next to his approval form. I'm familiar with the clause, Julian, I said. I was, after all, the lead architect who insisted on its inclusion with Mr. Sterling's full support to protect the long-term integrity of the Hawthorne district. Julian stared at the document, then at me, his face slowly draining of color. The lawyers exchanged nervous glances. This is outrageous, he stammered. You're deliberately obstructing progress. Am I? I replied, my gaze steady. Or am I upholding a contractual obligation, one designed to prevent exactly this kind of inappropriate, oversized development from compromising one of the city's most valued public spaces? Your gateway towers, Julian, are not in keeping with the master plan or the spirit of Hawthorne. They are, frankly, a travesty. You can't do this. He blustered, his voice rising. I'm the CEO. And I said, tapping the highlighted clause with one finger, am the signatory authority on this matter. And I do not approve. I paused, letting the silence stretch, thick and heavy. In fact, I've already formally notified the city and the bank of my decision to withhold approval, citing clear violations of the established design principles for the Hawthorne Zone. Julian looked like he'd been slapped. The arrogance, the condescension, it all just deflated. He stared at the old contract, then at me, a dawning comprehension and fury in his eyes. He had walked right into a meticulously laid trap, one he hadn't even seen because he'd been too busy admiring his own reflection. The relic had just brought his flagship project to a grinding halt. And the beauty of it was, I had done nothing more than uphold the terms of an agreement he hadn't bothered to understand. The silence in that opulent office was suddenly deafening, broken only by the faint, distant hum of the city, a city whose heritage I had just, in my own quiet way, protected. The fallout was immediate. Julian Croft, for all his bluster, found himself utterly hamstrung. The Hawthorne Gateway Towers project was dead in the water without my approval, and I had made it unequivocally clear that approval would not be forthcoming for his current design. The investors grew nervous. The bank consortium formally withdrew its funding offer, citing unresolved compliance issues and significant project risk. Julian's star, which had risen so meteorically, began to plummet just as fast. His bold vision had crashed against the unyielding rock of a forgotten contractual clause and an architect he had grievously underestimated. A few days after that confrontation, I walked into Julian's office, uninvited this time, and placed my resignation letter on his desk. It was brief, just 3 sentences. I stated my departure was effective immediately. I noted that my professional obligations regarding the Hawthorne district were now, in a manner of speaking, fulfilled, and I wished him well in navigating the company's future. There was no anger in it, no triumph, just a quiet finality. He didn't look up from his screen. I didn't expect him to. The real surprise came later that day. My phone began to ring. First, Marcus Thorne. "Ellie," he said, his voice warm, "I heard about your decision. And about your resignation. My current projects with Sterling and Thorne are officially on hold. We need to talk about your next chapter. Because whatever it is, I want my company to be a part of it." Then, an email from Diana Marlowe. The City Council had just voted to indefinitely postpone consideration of any new large-scale development proposals for the Hawthorne adjacent zones, pending a comprehensive review of existing master plan covenants. She added a personal note. "Ellie, your integrity has saved something precious. When you're ready, let's discuss how we can continue to build a better city together." Lena Hansen and Robert Bell called jointly. "We're pulling our community housing project from Sterling and Thorne," Lena announced. "We told Julian that our loyalty was to the design philosophy you embody, not to a corporate name. We have a small seed grant for our next phase. Would you consider leading it, Ellie, if you were independent?" By the end of the week, Sterling and Thorne had lost 4 major clients, and the Hawthorne Gateway debacle was becoming a cautionary tale in the city's business pages. Julian was reportedly in damage control mode, but the damage was, by then, extensive. I took a week off. A real one. I walked by the ocean, read books that had nothing to do with building codes, and let the quiet rhythm of the waves wash away the accumulated stress and disillusionment. And I began to think, not about what I'd lost, but about what I could build anew. With a modest loan against my savings and the unwavering support of Marcus, Diana, Lena, and Robert, I found a small, light-filled studio space in a beautifully restored heritage building downtown, ironically, not far from the Hawthorne district. I filed the paperwork to establish Vance Design Collaborative. It wasn't about ego or about having my name on the door. It was about collaboration, about mentorship, about creating a space where design integrity and thoughtful, context-sensitive architecture could flourish. One afternoon, as I was unpacking boxes of books and drafting tools, there was a hesitant knock on the open studio door. It was Maya Sharma, the young architect from Sterling and Thorne. She looked nervous, but determined. "Ellie, Ms. Vance," she began, I resigned from Sterling and Thorne this morning. I heard what you did, what you stood for. And well, I was wondering if Vance Design Collaborative might be hiring?" A genuine smile spread across my face, the kind that reached my eyes. "Maya," I said, "pull up a chair. Let's talk about the future. And please call me Ellie." I sat at my new drafting table, the afternoon sun streaming through the large arched window, illuminating the clean sweep of white paper before me. The city skyline, a tapestry of old and new, stretched out beyond the glass. It wasn't the sprawling office I'd had at Sterling and Thorne, not the established power. This was something different. Smaller, yes, but imbued with a sense of purpose, of freedom. My phone buzzed. A new email. Subject: "Welcome. Vance Design Collaborative. Project proposal attached." It was from Marcus. I picked up my favorite pencil, the one that felt like an extension of my own hand, and as the city hummed its quiet, steady song, I began to sketch. I was no longer a relic. I was an architect, once again drafting a new skyline on my own terms. They thought they could erase me, like an old pencil line on a blueprint. What they forgot is that some lines define the entire structure. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I learned that true value isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet integrity of the foundation, the kind that withstands any storm. The skyline of my life looks different now, clearer, brighter, and built on my own terms. The best designs I've found often come after you've been forced to clear the old site. If you've ever felt undervalued or seen your contributions dismissed, know that your worth isn't determined by someone else's limited vision. It's in the skills you've honed, the relationships you've built with integrity, and the quiet strength you find within. If this story resonated with you, if you've walked a similar path or are perhaps navigating one now, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories matter. And if you find a piece of yourself in these journeys of quiet resilience, consider subscribing to TK Revenge Story. We have many more blueprints of the human spirit to share. You can also support the channel through the Super Thanks button. Sometimes, giving back is its own form of rebuilding. Thank you for listening and for being part of this community.